they have any questions, to put it in the chat box so that we can have a discussion at the end of the presentation.
Yasir, you have to. All right, okay. If you put your camera on, we can see you. All right.
So thanks, Sujit. Thanks, Rainer, for organizing this event. Now, let's start with our prime goal. So today I will focus on the ecological perspectives of suicide, emphasizing that how suicide is overly interconnected with multiple factors. So these are my important works, that is Suicide in Bangladesh, and it is also translated in German. So Rainer, you can have a look, and I also translated it in Bangla. Our next important work is hopefully coming this year, that is suicidal behavior in Muslim majority countries. So as per the WHO report 2021, in 2019, across the globe, there are 703,000 suicide deaths, and 77% of the deaths happens in low and middle income countries. The global rate was 9 per 100,000, and it is the fourth leading cause of death among 15 to 29 years of age. But surprisingly, it is most important concern that most of the low and middle income countries have poor or low quality suicide data. So the actual suicide deaths could be higher than the number reported in the WHO report. So before going into the details, let's check the classifications, that is suicide and suicidal behavior. So basically, suicidal behavior includes the suicidal idea or thought that can be active or passive, suicidal plan, suicidal attempt, and finally suicide. So what is suicide? Suicide is a fatal self-injurious act with some evidence of intent to die. So how would be the suicide attempt? So a potentially self-injurious behavior associated with at least some intent to die. So suicidal ideations could be active, dying by the one's wish with acts or plans, and passive ideations reflected by thoughts about death or wanting to be dead without any plan or intent. So the another major area is non-suicidal self-injury. So it is self-injurious behavior with no intent to die. There is another concept, that deliberate self-harm. Any type of self-injurious behavior, including suicide attempt and non-suicidal self-injury. So studies have been identified that at least 10 to 20 times higher rates of suicidal attempt than the actual suicide. So the formal study on suicide started in 1950s in US and Canada, and a bit earlier in France, but still not much have been detected to indicate a statistically significant reduction in national suicide rates, at least in the Western countries, especially US and Canada. And also, there is not significant targets achieved in reduction of suicide deaths globally. So it is still a mystery why people die. What are the risk factors behind the suicide attempt or suicide? So one of the earliest monograph on that published by Emile Durkheim in 1897. So he classified the suicide deaths based on moral regulation and social integration. So he classified 4 types of suicide deaths. Number 1 is altruistic, 2 egoistic, 3 anomic, and fatalistic. So when the social integration was high, then there may have altruistic suicides for suicides based on the betterment of the community. And when the integration is so low, then people feels threatened belongingness, and as people become isolated, and egoistic suicides happen. So when the moral regulation is too high, then fatalistic attempts happens, and when there is no social moral regulation, then it happens the anomic suicides. He explained that the anomic suicides usually happen suddenly, mostly based on life events. So in the recent time, for assessing risk factor, psychological autopsy studies have been considered as gold standard studies, even though there are lots of criticisms of the methods and the process of identifying the risk factors. The recent meta-analysis identified that they used 37 case control studies from 23 countries, and they identified 40 risk factors. They classified the risk factors into 4 groups, that is clinical factors, socio-demographic status, family history, and adverse life events. And interestingly, among the 4 factors, the meta-analysis identified that clinical factors have the highest odds of suicide, followed by self-harm or previous suicide attempt. One of the earliest systematic review of psychological autopsy studies, here both the case control studies and case series studies were included. They found that the median proportion of cases with mental disorder was 91% for case series studies, and in the case control studies it was 90%. So another meta-analysis after about 1.5 decade, they identified 48 studies with 6,626 suicides. They estimated that the mean prevalence rate of any mental disorder is 80%. So the key message is here we found that the prevalence of mental disorders is about is more than 80%, at least more than 80%. So whatever the risk factors we have or evidence we have is supporting mostly to the individual persons, that is psychiatric disorder or clinical factors. Now, as there are risk factors in multiple domains, so how the risk factors interact? Yes, the gene environment interactions, it is one of the prominent theories, and process of interactions, that is some genetically predisposed persons interact differently with the environment, and they have different behavior, emotion, cognition, and perception, and they attempt for suicide. The biopsychosocial approach is in the most recent world is the more well accepted method for fitting in the every psychiatric disorders as well as the treatments. So biologically, suicide emerges from the biochemical component of psychiatric disorders, biological transmission of suicidal risk across generations, maternal illness during pregnancy, and difficulty in birth process, or physical disease. So then it interacts with psychological component, that is suicide happens due to the internal reason to deal with rejection and deprivation. And sociological theory that not really fixing with the Durkheim's view, but the social factors interacting with the biological and psychological factors. So we will discuss the what are the prominent social factors. So one prominent study published in Lancet in 29, so the authors divided the risk factors in 2 categories. That is the distal factors and proximal factors. So these two categories, there would have interactions among these categories, and that would direct the suicide attempt. So the distal factors are genetic loading, personality characteristics, including impulsivity, aggression, restricted fetal growth, and perinatal circumstances, early traumatic life event, and neurobiological disturbances like serotonin dysfunction and hypothalamo-pituitary axis hyperactivity. The proximal factors are psychiatric disorders, physical disease, psychosocial crisis, availability of means for suicide attempt, and exposure to the models in the nearby environment. So these factors have been categorized in a different view, that is population risk factors and the individual risk factors. So Truckee and Brent categorize it in different way. They mention the interaction as environment and the individual factors. So what are the population risk factors? These are the rapid change in social structure or values. These are the social factors. Economic turmoil, again social factors. Social isolation, social factors. Media reports of suicide and suicidal behavior, social factor. Access to means for suicide attempts, social factors, and poor access to mental health care. Again, these are the population risk factors. So what could be the individual risk factors? So individual risk factors have been classified in three areas, that is distal or predisposing factor, developmental or mediating factor, and proximal or precipitating factor. So distal factor, there have genetic loading, family history, early life adversity or epigenetic changes, and stable changes in genetic functions that interacts with the developmental mediators, that is high anxiety, high impulsivity, chronic substance uses. And finally, it comes into the attempt when there would have behavioral disinhibition, acute substance abuse, biological and genetic factors would interact with the life events, hopelessness, and psychopathology. So what are the existing theoretical explanations for suicide attempt or suicide? The earliest and prominent theory or psychic theory, according to this theory that is proposed by Schneidman 1993, according to psychic theory, psychological pain or psychic is the only necessary factor for suicide attempt. So what about the other factor? That all other factors such as depression and hopelessness are secondary and only relevant to suicide insofar their association with psychic. So psychic is the only necessary factor as per the psychic theory for suicide attempt. Then Joyner explained the interpersonal theory of suicide in 25. So he, as per the interpersonal theory of suicide, there must have a combination of three factors, that is thought and belongingness, perceived burdensomeness, and acquired capability of suicide. So the suicide attempt will happen only if these three conditions accumulate on individual. So thought and belongingness, I am alone; perceived burdensomeness, I'm burdensome; and capability for suicide, yes, I can attempt or I can complete the suicide. Then 2011, Rory O'Connor proposed the integrated motivational and volitional theory, and it was sorry, it was further extended in 2018 by O'Connor and his colleague. So here he focused that the theory emphasized on the understanding the why people die by suicide with a particular focus on psychology of suicidal mind. And the model developed from the recognition that suicide is a characterized by a complex interplay of biology, psychology, environment, and culture. And it also mentioned that we need to move beyond the psychiatric category if we are further understand the causes of suicide. So the theory conceptualized in 3 phases, that is pre-motivational phase, motivational phase, and volitional phase. So pre-motivational phase is the same with the distal factors, that is genetic loading and their interaction with environment with life event. The motivational phase, yes, there have defeat, humiliation, entrapment, and suicidal attempt. The volition phase, importantly, there access to the means and impulsivity, physical tolerance of physical pains, and fearlessness. In 2015, Kloski and May proposed a different theory, that is ideation to action theory or 3-step theory. So here they mentioned that are you in pain and hopelessness? If yes, you have suicidal ideation. Is your pain greater than your connectedness? If yes, then a strong suicidal ideation. And are you able to attempting suicide? Then suicidal attempt. Okay, now the ecological perspective. In 1979, Uri Bronfenbrenner, an Russian-American psychologist, published a book on ecology of human development. So in that book, he introduced a new theory of human development that emphasized the interactive process between the person and environment. So he proposed that basically there are several systems around in our living place. So the first ontogenic system comprised of the person himself, the age, sex, or genetic loading or something else. Then he has interaction with the surrounding environment, that is family, church, school, and peers, that consist of microsystems. And then there is a larger mesosystem. Mesosystem is a system of systems. So there are several multiple systems that interacts with on other and together. That is the mesosystem. And then it extends further to the neighbors, social services, industry, mass media, and local politics. That is the exosystem. And macrosystem. Macrosystem attitude, ideologies for culture, and comprising the macro system. Again, there is another system, that is chronosystem. So here we see that ontogenic system, then microsystem, mesosystem, exosystem, macrosystem, and chronosystem. Okay, now let's check some published papers. Indicating the why suicide is outside the individual person or need a larger control for suicide prevention. So suicide rate in relation to the HDI in 91 countries. So their study found that suicide rate is significantly higher among males, and it has significant differences based on the Human Development Index. So it has 11.6 in very high development countries, then nearly 8 in medium development countries, and 14 in high development countries. So there are variations on suicide rate based on the HDI index. So suicide rate varies greatly between countries with different developmental levels. Now, an important study, that is natural experiments, impact of inbuilt environment on suicide rate. So the study was conducted in Hong Kong, built environment and suicide rate over 13 years of period observed in 151 rent-only public housing communities. So they identified 3 important significant factors associated with suicide. That is the distance to nearest urban center, distance to nearest mass transit railway station, and gross flat area per person. So the study concluded that a significant association between features of built environment and suicide rate. Now, Milner et al. Identified socioeconomic determinants of suicide in 35 countries. So they identified that suicide rates are associated with increased female labor force, unemployment, and proportion of persons over 65 years. Number one observation. Number two, reductions in suicide rates were associated with increased health spending per capita, and higher fertility was associated with reduction in male suicide. Female labor force participated had a stronger effect on male suicide rates. Now, a study conducted in German, it's a German microcensus data to register all data on about 1,50,000 German suicides since 1997 to 2010. So they found that increases in district suicide rate by 1.2% for 1% increases in district unemployment, and suicide rate decreases of 0.4% for 1% increases in income. Another study identified that ecological factor among suicide mortality for non-Hispanic whites. So the strongest contextual predictor of higher suicide mortality are lower rates of manufacturing employment and higher rates of opioid prescription in for all age and sex group. Increased gun accessibility for men and religious participation for older people. So it is a study in Australia. They identified the suicide risk and its association with the drought. So they found that an increased relative risk of suicide of 15% for rural males aged 30 to 49 years when the drought index rose from first quartile to third quartile, and suicide increased risk of suicide in spring and early summer. We have seen this variation in seasonal variation in other contexts in other countries also. So suicides are higher in spring and early summer. Now, we see that an Italian data, they extracted from 26 and 28. They include the database to include all deaths by suicide and natural causes. They found that, interestingly, 15 to 64 years of age, suicide deaths are significantly more often to have a higher educational attainment compared with the same sex and age counterparts. So they explained that persons with higher school attainment compared with those with a maximum primary school degree had significant increased odds ratio for dying from a suicide rather than natural cause. So academic attainment is a risk factor for suicide, according to this paper. Now, the paper assesses the greenness and suicidal behavior. So the papers, the authors identified that a negative association between greenness, exposure, and suicide mortality. And greenness significantly decreased the risk of suicide. The relative risk was 0.7. Now, religion, it is almost well accepted that suicides are lower in Muslims, and according to the rates, it is high in Hindus. On interesting study on 46 Muslim majority countries with checking the associations with suicide rate and other ecological variables, the study identified that there is inverse association between total suicide rate in males and females with HDI and income of the country. So it is only the Muslim majority countries. The suicide rate was significantly higher in countries with democratic systems compared to the non-democratic countries. So in earlier study, we have seen that the HDI suicide rate has variations based on the HDI, but there is no linear relationship. But in this study, the relationship is linear, and inverse association, the total suicide rate and the suicides in males and suicide in females. Now, media and suicide. It will be will explained by Dr. Professor Vikash in a later time. But we have already known that the further effect and Papageno effect. So further effect that insensible media reporting creates the suicidal behavior in the community people, and Papageno effect, sensible media reports can reduce the suicidal behavior in the community. The meta-analysis identified that risk of suicide increased by 13% in the period after a media reported death of a celebrity suicide. Yes, as I mentioned earlier, that there is a strict seasonal variation in suicides based on the region and the geographic location of the country. But mostly it's summer, and it's more higher in summer. So unemployment and suicidal behavior. Unemployment increases suicide rates. Now the natural disasters and suicidal behavior. In Japan, it was found that male suicide rates increased after an earthquake. In Taiwan, there was a decrease in suicide rate after an earthquake, and in Sri Lanka, there was no impact. However, a review paper conducted on the impact of natural disasters identified that there is an increase of suicide after natural disasters. Importantly, likewise, the other ecological factors, several methodological problems in this research. Now, the air pollution. Can we think about that air pollution can lead to suicide attempt? This meta-analysis include 12 studies of the association of air pollutants and suicide, published between 2010 and 2019. They assess the concentration of nitrogen dioxide, sulfur dioxide, ozone, and carbon monoxide. They found that air pollution had a strong impact on suicide for people aged less than 64 years, suicide occurring on summer days, and for violent methods of suicide. But there is no difference between men and women. So based on this plenty of evidence, WHO in 2009 endorsed a public health multi-layered, multidisciplinary approach for suicide prevention, and that should be the shifting the focus from individuals to the environment. Also, the CDC CDC of US has also adopted the similar measures of socio-ecological model for suicide prevention, and they are focusing on individual, relationship, community, and societal factors. So finally, what we understand that suicide is extremely complex and multifactorial, and that is the reason why the suicide prevention programs are not getting benefit despite of a huge effort and a huge research on it. There is no one-to-one relationship with any risk factor and suicidal behavior. and wider variables needs to be considered while formulating the suicide prevention strategies on the basis of country perspective, region perspective, as well as the global perspective. So thank you very much. Thank you, Sujit.
Thank you, Dr. Yasir, for a very comprehensive presentation on ecology of suicide. We have some questions in the chat box. The first question is by Professor Renner. Sometimes suicide have different times from thought to decision and action. Do the risk factors act differently at different time points? This was the question by Professor Renner.
So please tell again. I couldn't understand.
Yeah, sometimes suicide have different times from thought to decision and action. So do the risk factors act differently at different time points?
Yes, I assume yes. Yes, the risk factors interacts differently in different persons, even in different situations.
Can you comment on that? So what is known about that?
So it's difficult to gauge. It depends on the situations, and based on the suicide attempt, there is a gross classification on that. That is impulsive attempt and unplanned attempt. So at least in South Asia, the impulsive attempt covers a good portion of suicide attempt. So for impulsive attempt, it happens just within minutes without considering the before and after effect or something like that. They just have an means and they attempt. And otherwise, it interact with differently. Those who planned, they may write suicide notes, they may lock their rooms, they may prepare their wills, so everything can happen. And the impulsive suicides may happen to the younger persons, and aggressive or the impulsive personality characteristics, that in this case the impulsivity may affect it, but precisely it's very difficult to say.
Okay, thank you.
There is another question by Christian Yom from Cameroon. Finally, seeing those articles, it seems like it comes back to regulation, that is inner and social one, and integration of concerned people. So he is basically commenting that suicidal behavior is a very complex phenomenon that happens because of interplay of inner and social regulation, as well as the integration of the common concerned people. Any comment on that?
Thanks for it.
Yes, sir.
No, thanks for his generous comment. Thanks.
And another comment by one of the audience is the suicide is different to each of the countries related to culture and spirituality. Yeah, it's already presented that religion may play different impact on the suicidal behavior. In different religions, they have high suicide rate, whereas in some religions, suicide rate is low. So it is having a role.
So in that case, I can share a little bit more experience. That is, we did some studies on suicidal behavior and compared it with the Muslim and non-Muslim countries. So we found that the suicidal ideation is more or less same, even higher in the Muslim countries. But a suicidal attempt or completed suicide is lower in Muslims.
Yeah, even in the Muslim countries, if you see that rate of suicide is not uniform across the countries. Like there are some Muslim countries with a high suicide rate, there are some Muslim countries with a low suicide rate. So
Yes.
probably religion is not the only factor that influences the suicide rate. There are some other ecological factors that do play important role. Another interesting question by Dr. Alok Jyoti Sahu. Any particular profession linked with suicide? Does a particular occupation is increasing the vulnerability for suicide?
Yes, we have seen the papers as far as we have that anesthesiologists, psychiatrists, and the physicians have the high risk for suicides. So
Among the
yes,
doctors.
so the profession may have the propensity to developing risk factors for suicide.
Yeah, even those individuals who are exposed to very stressful professions, the rate of suicide is bit higher. So here exactly the profession rather than the individual's resilience and the amount of stress that is produced that plays a detrimental role. And same another question by any range of time schedule of the day. Uh, uh, if you see the suicide, any particular time where most of the suicide happens, there are some papers related to ecology, any particular time of the day where the suicide
We,
happens.
uh, we did a similar study in Bangladesh regarding the time. But after first study, we thought that something have revealed that is really interesting. But the subsequent studies revealed a different time schedule. So my understanding that usually it doesn't follow, but night could be a potential factor.
Okay. I had just one observation that recently the National Crime Records Bureau has released a suicide related information in India. So consistently what we are getting, the attributing factor of suicide is family problems. It's not mental illness, rather the family problems is responsible for associated factor of suicide. So that is something very unique to country. But the challenge is the information is from the police database. So whatever information that is documented by the police is there. So it is not a systematic analysis of attributing factors of suicide. So what's your take-home message on that? What is happening in Bangladesh and other countries as a common associated factor of suicide? Is it mental illness or something else?
It's a really interesting question. So, and I totally agree with the context. However, the situation may be different if we store the data scientifically. I am not telling that still the data is not scientific, but the impurity can be resolved. The picture can be small difference that would be. So on the main point, I totally agree with that. The for suicide, psychiatric disorders are secondary, at least in Bangladesh and also in India. So the life events and familial factors. So our psychological autopsy study identified that 57% of the risk factors are associated with the family. And we analyzed the data in a population attributable fraction. So there we found that 86% of the suicides could be prevented if the life events could be managed. So I think it's the same scenario will replicate in South Asia, which is quite different from the Western countries in regards to the psychiatric disorders. And importantly, the reviews we have identified on psychological autopsy studies mostly done in Western countries and developed countries. So the low and middle income country setting could have a different picture, and mostly it will be related, or it may be related with the family factor or relationship issue.
Thank you so much, Dr. Yasir Arafat, for your comprehensive presentation. Thank you so much. Despite of your ill health, you made the presentation. I highly appreciate your efforts. Thank you so much. Now, moving on to the next presentation, I would like to invite Dr. Vikas Menon, who is currently working as a professor of psychiatry at Jawaharlal Institute of Postgraduate Medical Education Research, Puducherry. He is having a keen research interest in suicide prevention and mood disorders. And he has published more than 70 peer-reviewed papers on the theme of suicide, and is having more than 300 publications and several book chapters. He is one of the lead investigator of Indian Psychiatric Society funded multicentric study on suicide crisis syndrome. He is a recipient of several research excellence awards, notably 2023 D. Leo Fund Award of International Association of Suicide Prevention in recognition of his outstanding research work on suicidal behavior carried out in developing countries. I request Dr. Vikas to uh, hand over to you, Dr. Vikas, for your presentation. Welcome.
Thank you, Dr. Sujit. Am I audible?
Yes.
Yes, sir. Yes, you are audible.
Okay, and can you confirm that my slides are visible in slideshow mode?
Yeah, the slide is visible. Yeah, it's full screen. It is visible.
Okay, so yeah, here we go. So thank you very much to the organizers of this webinar for having me over here. Thank you also to my co-speaker for setting the ground so beautifully with a very exhaustive presentation on the ecological aspects of suicide, one of which is also media reporting, which he did touch upon briefly when he discussed about the Werther and the Papageno effect. I intend to take the topic a little further here and talk about the context of media reporting of suicide, the current scenario in India, and then broadly